Good evening. Welcome to our next installment of the Shemona Esrei, Judaism's principal prayer, in which we praise God, which is how we create a relationship with God. Then we make our request of Him, which is another level of a relationship, because you don't ask someone for something that you don't have a relationship with, and that deepens the relationship. And then you express your gratitude for all that God has given us, which is, of course, a third dimension of this relationship. We're still in the middle of dealing with the requests, and we're up to the 12th blessing. This 12th blessing is a blessing that has a lot of negative overtones to it. I guess if you have 18 or 19 blessings, you're allowed to have one negative one. It has to be taken in context. This is not the original part of the Shemona Esrei. It was added on. Whenever anything is added on to a very fixed structure, you know that there's something very crucial, an emergency situation that came up that necessitated this. This is the blessing in which we ask God to take care in pretty strong terms of a certain class of people that are referred to first as informers. Now, this is a blessing in which we ask God to remove one of the most formidable threats to our survival, to our existence. As Maimonides points out, all of the requests in the Shemona Esrei reflect the basic needs of us as a nation and as individuals. One of the most important and most basic needs of a nation is that it does not have a threat to its survival, either from within or from without. And this blessing covers both, although the focus is on the threats from the outside. This is a blessing in which we ask God to subdue, destroy all of our enemies, and chief among the enemies are the informers, which we'll get into as we go on. According to the Midrash, this blessing was first recited by the angels. Angels are celestial beings. They are responsible for the forces of nature. So this is a blessing that comes from nature itself, you could say, in response to the drowning of the Egyptians who were pursuing the Jews as they were leaving Egypt, threatening to enslave them again, and perhaps even worse than that, in retaliation for all the 10 plagues. And now the enemies, the threat of the Jewish people that could have aborted the fledgling Jewish nation as they emerged victoriously and freely from bondage, this threat was aborted. This threat was no longer a threat. So the angels cried out in praise to God, and they said this blessing, thanking God, extolling God for saving the Jewish people. The history of this blessing, according to the Talmud, is that in the 2nd century, the days of Rabbi Gamliel II, this Rabbi Gamliel was a great grandson of the famous Hillel, lived in a time when the Romans were in total control over Israel. And it became necessary to compose a prayer that would have God take care of, destroy those who were threatening the Jewish people's very existence. And he was looking around for someone who could compose this prayer, and he found one great rabbi who, ironically, was called Shmuel the Small one. This is how great he really was, that everyone knew him as the Small One because of his humility, because of his very pure and pristine character, a man who was devoid of any malice, a man who was devoid of any ego, and he was seen to be the one who was fit to compose this prayer. According to some historians, based on other parts of the Talmud, it seems that this prayer was actually around centuries before and was instituted by the same authors of the Shemona Esrei, the men of the Great Assembly, to deal with problems in that particular age. However, it became neglected and was no longer considered that important until a new need, a new existential threat to the Jewish people arose. What was the original threat? Why did they compose this prayer originally, if we follow that version? Because the Jewish people were being undermined by the Samaritans. The Samaritans were a group of converts to Judaism whose conversion was considered to be suspect. There's a biblical account of these people known as the Kusim, who were brought to Israel by the Assyrian Empire. When they used to conquer a country, they would transfer the indigenous population to another part of the world and bring the people, the tribes from that part of the world to this newly conquered country, which is what happened in Israel. The Kusim, who came from further east, were brought into Samaria, hence the name Samaritans. And these Samaritans were converted to Judaism because of a threat of lions that were attacking them, and they took that as a divine omen that they had to become Jewish, but they were not really sincere according to most of the opinions. They were idolaters, they retained their pagan ways, and they will always try to undermine the Jewish people. This is not the time and place to go into the whole history of the Samaritans, but suffice it to say that they were the major threat to the Jewish people because of how they collaborated with any potential enemy of the Jews. When Alexander the Great came to conquer the land of Israel, the Samaritans tried to influence him to destroy the temple, and that was thwarted, and that's a whole story unto itself, which we won't go into. So that prayer was composed to deal with the Samaritans. Centuries later, the need for this prayer became, again, a very important need because of the Sadducees that tried to undermine the authority of the rabbis. But when Rabbi Gamliel had Shmuel HaKatan compose it or recompose it, as whatever the case may be, the threat was from the new Christian groups that were originally led by Jews who were using their association with the Romans to inform against the Jewish community, and that was the major threat the Jews were suffering from then. But when we say this prayer, we have to realize that a prayer is multidimensional. Yes, we're asking God to protect us from the external enemies. There's no question about that. That was the primary focus of this prayer, and that was the impetus for this prayer, the threat from the outside. But it also deals with the threat from our internal evil, our internal negativity. We all have our own weaknesses, our own vices, our own imperfections, if you will, and in some cases outright evil, and we're asking God to destroy and subdue that type of evil. And there's also a third element that commentaries point out. There's evil that you can't say we're born with evil. We're not born with evil. We're born with animalistic tendencies that could lead us in the direction of evil. But then there's the energy that we generate through our evil actions. Whenever we do something that is immoral, against the Torah, we generate a force, an angel as it were, and that angel becomes an additional threat to us and undermines our ability to survive as a people and as individuals. So we're asking God to get rid of the external evil, the internal evil, and the evil that we generate through our own actions. Now, this follows the blessing in which we ask God to restore justice, as it was in the days of old when we had divine justice meted out through the Sanhedrin, the chosen leaders and sages of the Jewish people. And the Talmud says there's a very neat connection between these two. It was inserted at this particular point, that is the 12th blessing, because once you deal with justice, and when justice will be complete, then we will get rid of all the evil in the world. As long as justice is compromised the way it is today, as long as justice is half-baked and incomplete, then there are people who could threaten us, and there is no way you could curtail them or control them. But once justice will be restored, we don't have to worry about evil anymore. So that's a very simple connection. It doesn't need much more clarification. This is the 12th blessing, and as we discussed in previous classes, that each number associated with that blessing has significance. What is the connection of number 12 to this blessing? The connection that is established is based on the fact that there are 12 tribes. The Jewish people are divided up into 12 different tribes, 10 of which we know were lost to us as a result of the Assyrian conquest of Israel about 2,700 years ago. And from that day onward, these 10 tribes are referred to as the 10 lost tribes. Although many people have tried to identify certain groups of people as being descendants of those lost 10 tribes, according to the Talmud, Jeremiah the prophet did bring some of them back to the fold. So we do have mixed up amongst the Jewish people some of the other 10 tribes. However, the Jewish people are not complete unless we have all 12 tribes. In the Messianic age, the 12 tribes will all be brought back, and we will have the full Jewish nation as a nation of its original 12 tribes. The threat to the Jewish people from informers is that it undermines the integrity of the Jewish people, because the informing against the people could lead to the destruction of a large segment of the Jewish people, which is something that happened in the past, and it's a great threat to our integrity as a nation. The Jewish people cannot survive with only a part of their tribes, only some of the tribes. We must have the entire people, and that's why the number 12 is a significant number over here. We start off the prayer with the words, "Let there be no hope for informers." Let there be no hope for informers. What is it about informers that gets us so riled up? Throughout Jewish history, I think it would be safe to say the Jewish people considered informers to be the very worst class of criminals in their midst. Yes, there were thieves, there were murderers even, but an informer was considered to be worse than a murderer because the informer was a potential mass murderer. The informer was the potential to destroy entire communities. In a way, it's a nuclear sin, because every sin has, as it is true in regard to good deeds, that you do a good deed and you reap some benefits commensurate with that good deed. But when a person does something that seems to be minor, informing is not even an action, it's just speech. Just calling up, making one phone call, if we use the modern, or one text message to the right authority, informing against a community, and that could lead, or although nowadays it's a little bit more difficult for it to be that destructive, but in the olden days that could have led to the destruction of an entire community. And there's a story that I like to relate in this regard. This story goes back about 150 years when the Tsar was planning on enacting certain laws that would further restrict, been understood very easily that it's the Tsar's edict that destroyed the community, and it's metaphorically referred to by the drop of ink that came from his pen. He says, we don't really know what the rabbis were referring to in those days when they spoke about a bird that laid an egg that destroyed many communities, but you have to put it in the context of what certain small actions by the right people or the wrong people could have devastating effects. That's what informing is, more than any other crime. When an informant wanted to get even with a Jewish community because he was insulted, he was not given an honor, he lost his job, but whatever it may be, instead of killing one person, all he had to do was go to the government, and the governments are more than happy to oblige, and say the Jews have done this against the government. They are guilty of treason, they're guilty of stealing, they're guilty of exploiting those who were not Jewish in that area. And that could have unleashed a pogrom sanctioned by the government where hundreds, maybe even thousands of Jews could be murdered just by one simple message that the informer sends to the authorities. So that's why informing was considered to be the worst crime in Jewish history, because it was a nuclear sin. The effects, the explosion, the ramifications were so uh, monumental that it was in a league unto itself. It's interesting that when Moses, first thing he did when he grew up and he wanted to see how his brethren were doing, and he sees an Egyptian beating a Jewish slave, Moses kills the Egyptian. The next day he sees two Jews fighting and he tells them to stop fighting. And one of them says, "Are you going to do to us as you did to the Egyptian?" And says Moses was terrified when he heard this. He wasn't terrified because he thought his life was in danger. Rashi says he was terrified because he thought, if Jews could stoop so low to inform against their brothers, then I don't know if there's any hope for them. Because when a person could go so low, the question is there anything redeeming about such a people? Well, of course, Moses was judging it based on that one action, and thank God that was an isolated case, but that demonstrates how seriously the crime of informing was viewed by our tradition, that even Moses was terrified when he saw that this was a vice that was plaguing the Jewish community, or the potential for it to be a Jewish community. So when we say there should be no hope for informers, we mean that the informers should have no way of succeeding in their nefarious work. According to some, the word hope here means very simply. Usually an informer would get paid for his informing. The government would pay these people. In communist Russia, it was very common for them to get a Jew to become a spy, to inform against his brothers and sisters. I know of cases that I heard from my own family members where one man was told that if he doesn't inform, his family would suffer. So he would come to the synagogue and he would tell everyone, please run away. Don't be in my presence. So I shouldn't be forced to inform against you. But unfortunately, there were some who did inform because their lives were in danger. And thank God the majority of the people who were subjected to that test did pass it and they did not become informers. But that was considered to be the most serious crime. And the enemies of the Jewish people took advantage of the power that informing had. So they should have no hope. They shouldn't gain anything from informing, and then maybe they will stop. The question, which is a question that we could have asked at the beginning, we could ask in the middle, we could ask at the end. It seems that this prayer is designed to have God destroy the informers, destroy the wicked people. This seems to be at odds with a passage in the Talmud. It's a very famous story in the Talmud. Rabbi Meir, one of the greatest sages of Israel, he was a student of Rabbi Akiva. He was a phenomenal scholar and saintly person, brilliant in every respect and righteous in every sense of the word. And he had people who lived in his neighborhood who were tormenting him, taunting him, and causing him untold misery. And he started praying to God, God, please destroy these wicked people. And his very wise wife, Beruria, chastised him and says, King David, the Psalms, says, Yitamu chatoyim min haaretz, that the sins should cease from the earth. The sins, not the sinners. So why are you praying for the sinners to die and to cease? You should pray that they no longer will be sinners. Pray that their sins should cease. He followed her advice. He prayed that the sins should cease, and they did, and these people changed. So that became a model for how we are to view people who commit crimes. We're supposed to look at them and say, yes, they committed these crimes. The crimes are wrong. We're not going to justify. We're not going to be tolerant. That's a word that has so perverted the sense of righteousness in our own time, that people have to be tolerant of everything. No, we have to be intolerant of certain behaviors But at the same time, we don't curse the person who owns those behaviors. We try to get him to disown them, that the sins should cease, not the sinners. Yet in this prayer, we seem to not focus on the sins, but on the sinners. Now, there are other versions of this prayer. There's some variations. Some of the words of the prayer might have been changed because of the fear of governments that might have taken this prayer as a Jew's desire to overthrow and destroy the government. So they might have changed some of the wording over here. But the original wording, and this is the way it is in the Chabad liturgy and in others as well, that we're asking God to destroy the evil nations, the evil people, not just the sins. And the answer to that is that emergency cases. There are times when we can't wait for the informer to change, because by the time the informer is ready to change, it'll be too late. The community will be destroyed. When a person threatens you, you can't use love and patience and tolerance to try to get the person to change, because that person is not going to change overnight. And meanwhile, the threat to the community is so great. And also, there are certain types of evil. You're a heretic. If you want to be a heretic, you have to study for many years. You have to become a genius, a master of all the biblical literature and the Talmud and all the philosophical works of Judaism. And then, after you become a master of all that, then you say, I don't believe in any of that. Then you're a heretic. You're just an ignoramus. You're no heretic. That's a title that you have to work hard to get. So I think based on that, today's heretics don't qualify. They shouldn't try to apply for that title. And when we say this prayer, we're not talking about modern day heretics, because the modern day heretic is really, and they may be offended by this, but they're really ignoramuses. They're people who may be brilliant, scientists, brilliant in any field, in every field that they are involved in, but they happen to be very limited in their knowledge of theology, their knowledge of Judaism, the knowledge of spirituality. They are not steeped in it. They were not raised in that environment. So when we talk about a heretic here, we're talking about someone who was steeped in Jewish values, who has studied and mastered Jewish texts, and then rebelliously says, I don't want to believe in all that. I want to reject all that. That person could pride himself and put the title heretic after his name. As with the famous story, someone comes to the rabbi and he says to the rabbi, I'm an atheist, I don't believe in God. And the rabbi says, the God you don't believe in, I don't believe in either. Because the way people become heretics is they create their own image of God. They create God in their own image, or some distorted view of what the Torah says about God. They didn't really learn what Judaism says about God. And that's the God they say couldn't possibly exist. One of the arguments you often hear people say, how come there's suffering in this world? If there's a God, how could there be suffering? Well, if that's how you define God, that God does not allow suffering, then of course you rejected that notion that there's a God. But the Torah itself talks about suffering in this world without trying to get into the subject of why there is suffering. But God and suffering are not incompatible. They are not mutually exclusive beliefs. There is God and there is suffering for whatever reason, or for whatever reason that we can never comprehend. Those are not mutually exclusive. So the heretic is the person who understands all this, studied all this, and then rejects it all. These are the people who are being asked. We're asking God to eliminate these types of people, these heretics. And intentional transgressors are the people who not just intentionally, but are rebellious in their transgression. Then we say, may all the enemies of your people speedily be cut off. Again, speedily. Why do we emphasize speedily? If you look through the Shemona Esrei, the word speedily is not used for everything. When we ask God for healing, I don't think it says the word speedily over there. It doesn't say speedily for healing. For prosperity, it doesn't say speedily. It says speedily for a few things, and we'll get to some of them later. It doesn't say, God forgive us speedily. But when it comes to redemption, it says speedily. And here also it says speedily. Why? Again, the urgency in this matter cannot be overstated, because when you have this threat to your existence, you cannot wait for something to develop perhaps in a positive vein. You have to cut it off as soon as you can. Now the term that's used over here is they should be cut off. The word cutting in Hebrew, the root of that word is kares. The same word, kares, if you rearrange the letters, it spells the word keser, crown. This is the mystical understanding of this prayer. Where does evil originate? Or perhaps I should rephrase the question. How does evil develop from a God that is good? That's one of the most important theological questions. Well, a partial answer to that question is that God is so transcendent, He is so great, that anything could possibly exist. In other words, if you look at God, does God really care if we do something right or we do something wrong? To paraphrase Job, he says, if you are righteous, are you giving God anything? If you're wicked, are you taking anything from Him? God is so great, infinitely great, that we can't add anything to Him or take anything away from Him. So a God that is so great and so awesome and so majestic and so infinite, He has room for everything, good and evil. That's what we call the level of Kesed. Righteous you are depends on how lacking you are to not deserve God's benevolence. But when you're talking about God's majesty, His infinite majesty, anyone could get energy and survive, even evil. So then how does evil get cut off? Remember the word for cutting off, kares, shares the same letters as the word keser, the crown, because it's also the crown that destroys evil. The infinite power of God also destroys evil. Why is that? Let's take the king. Let's take the analogy of the king. Someone goes over to the king and says, I think you're an idiot. Well, the king is not really insulted. He's not offended. Take another example, some brilliant scientist, some brilliant philosopher. A 5-year-old kid goes over to him and says, you know what? You don't know anything. Now, does he really feel insulted? If it was another scientist who said, you don't know anything, what you say is ridiculous, he would be offended. It's in his league. But if a little kid says something to this brilliant mind that you're not very smart or your science is faulty, he takes it as a joke. He doesn't care. It doesn't bother him. However, if this undermines his plan, if, let's say, to use another example, if the scientist is trying to produce some major work and some nobody comes along and says something that will undermine the respect we have for him, and that will in turn undermine his ability to transmit his knowledge, or in the case of the king, the fact that some nobody insults the king and gets away with it, that will undermine the respect that the country has for the king and bring to a breakdown of society. Then the king says, oh, 1 second, I will have to stop that. I'll have to nip that in the bud. So the very level, the greatness of the king dictates that on one hand, he doesn't care even evil could exist. On the other hand, when he has to ensure his position, not his personal hurt, that he's offended by it, but his position as the king, that he is in control of the country and he can't allow for a breakdown of society, then he will cut that person off. So that's why in this prayer, we ask God, it says, if we know that evil has power, God gives it power because God is infinite, that even evil can get his power. But that infinite God also has the ability to ensure that evil doesn't survive and certainly doesn't thrive, because that would undermine God's whole plan for this world. Then we ask God, may you speedily, again the word speedily is used here, uproot, destroy, crush, and subdue the wicked kingdom speedily in our days. In the Ashkenaz version, it doesn't have the wicked kingdom, and I think that might be because of the fear the Jews had in the Middle Ages to say anything disparagingly about whatever kingdom they lived in. And even though they didn't say which kingdom is the wicked one, the wicked people know who they're referring to, that it was their own country, because and I'm sure they treated others horribly as well. But the Jews suffer from almost every country in Europe, either an expulsion from England, from France, and from Germany, and from virtually every other country in Europe, or pogroms, blood libels, and what have you, so speedily in our days. Now, the fact that it has four expressions over here: uproot, destroy, crush, and subdue. It's not just piling on more synonyms here. According to Kabbalah, storm wind, burning fire, and a huge cloud, all destructive forces. Those refer to what is called Sholosh Klipos Hatmeos, the three are totally impure. There's not even a trace of positivity in those three areas of evil, of impurity. And then the prophet Ezekiel refers to Nogalo. There's a radiance that surrounds it. That it's not utterly evil. Take, for example, a person who has an urge to murder someone. That's utterly unmitigated evil. What about a person who has a desire to indulge? You can't say that that's inherently evil. Desire is not evil. Desire is neutral. It can be channeled in a good direction, just as it can be channeled in a negative direction. So do you have to destroy the murderous tendency that a person has? Yes, that has to be destroyed. Do you have to destroy something that is harmful to others? Yes. But do you have to destroy the desire for things? No. Desire itself is neutral, and that you have to subdue, that it shouldn't be harnessed to something negative, but you don't destroy it. So those are the three impure shells, as they're called, versus the one shell that is impure, but it has some light in it, it has some salvageable components to it. And when we recite this prayer, it's customary, in the Chabad tradition at least, to pause after the first three. After saying uproot, destroy, crush, you then pause and then say subdue the wicked kingdom, as if to underscore the difference between the two. Now, when we say wicked kingdom, we're not only talking about, as I mentioned before, a particular government, although that is certainly meant by it, but it also means the kingdom of evil, the structure of evil in general. That kingdom that God created, He created it for a purpose, that we destroy it, that we eliminate it, or subdue it and transform it, depending on what aspect of the kingdom we're talking about. Even when we talk about governments, there are two types of governments. I think it's fair to say that every government of every country, there might be some exception that I'm going to miss, in all of history until the last few centuries, was evil. Every single government had laws that were passed that were discriminatory. And if we're talking about the Jewish people, I don't know of any government in all of history that had a perfect record in terms of how it treated Jews. There were some better ones and some worse ones. The Romans were the most horrible of all, murdered millions of Jews. Greeks were horrible. The Ottomans were horrible. The Babylonians, the Assyrians, and even the Persians, that were not as bad. Certain times, there was other times when they were horrible. It's only in modern times that we're seeing, and I think this is because it's a pre-Messianic experience, that we're seeing some of the light, where we find countries that have this noga, this salvageable character. We're not saying that they're all holy governments, that they're perfect, but they have this redeeming quality. United States, the Rebbe has said so many times, is called a malchus shel chesed, a benevolent government, a government that has based its whole constitution and its whole existence on freedom for everyone, opportunity for everyone. And by and large, it has been favorable to the Jewish people, supports Israel, and so on and so forth. So when we're saying this prayer, we're not asking God, God forbid, to destroy every country in the world, the evil ones. And it was shameful when President Reagan referred to communist Russia as the evil empire, and the media got all upset about that. How does he call something who it's not our right to call them evil empire? They were an evil empire. They murdered millions of people. They persecuted Jews. And to try to somehow say, well, that's our opinion, but they're entitled to their opinion, is absolute evil in and of itself. We have to recognize this prayer. And again, Shemona Esrei is very positive. This one blessing, which is negative, is the amount of negativity we're allowed to have. But when we're talking about a positive government, the Western countries in the world today, most of which are no longer the pure, unmitigated evil. There's a lot of positive energy, and we have to ask God to subdue the negativity to allow the positive elements to emerge. Then we say, "Blessed are you, God, who destroys the enemies and humbles the wicked." Now, I have a question over here that I don't have an answer for. The word for wicked here is Zaydim. Zaydim, the root of the word is Zadon, which means intentional. A person does something intentionally, spitefully, not based on ignorance, not based on unwittingly, but they do something spitefully, intentionally, wittingly. And before, when it spoke about these Zaydim, it talked about destroying them. You go back to the beginning of the prayer. Hebrew, B'chol haminim, B'chol hazaydim, kerega yovedu. The heretics and all the wicked, that's the translation of the word Zaydim, so shall instantly perish. That doesn't give them any hope. We're asking for them to perish, and instantly. And yet here at the end, where we use the same word in the end of the prayer, the very last word, we ask God to subdue the people who commit intentional crimes, the wicked. Why does it change? All of a sudden, it goes from destroy them instantly and then just subdue them, which means that there's something salvageable about them. We just have to subdue them. It could be, and this is just conjecture, that initially these people have to be destroyed because this type of evil is not salvageable. But after we go through the prayer and we get rid of the evil that surrounds these people, then they are no longer in the category that they have to be destroyed. See, if you look at the beginning of the prayer, the word Zaydim is in the context of Minim. Minim are the heretics. As long as you have an elite, an intellectual elite, because the heretics have to be intellectual elites, they are the ones who are guiding the Zaydim, the intentional sinners. They can't be salvaged. If you look at Nazi Germany, if it wasn't for the intellectual elite, you wouldn't have had the Nazis doing the things that they did. In all of these different episodes of hatred, of anti-Semitism, there was always an intellectual elite that was pushing for this type of evil. But then, and over here, we're no longer talking about the minim, the intellectual elite. We're talking just about enemies. Well, if you're just talking about enemies, there's always people who just tag along, but there's no one to really fuel their hatred and their evil, and then they can be salvaged. That's just a possibility. There's one other thought. When he said, we have one other thing over here, parallel to the sixth blessing. That's quite easy to see the parallel. The sixth blessing was asking God to redeem us from our suffering, from our pain as individuals, not national suffering and pain. In this prayer, we're asking God to get rid of our national suffering and pain inflicted on us by the informers, the heretics, the enemies, the evil nations who persecute us. And we're asking God, please get rid of these threats to us nationally, just as we ask you to redeem us as individuals. Just one other point, in the prayer it spoke about how get rid of them instantly. Why this instantly? He uses the word speedily twice, but here it's instantly. So one of the commentaries points out, there's a passage in the Talmud, that God generally is compassionate. But there's one instant during the day where God's unmitigated judgment is very strong. And if you could curse someone in that very fleeting moment, that curse will materialize. And Bilam, the heathen prophet, knew that instant. And all the time that he tried to curse us, he was waiting for that moment. That moment is about a 16th of a second, the Talmud says. God didn't get angry throughout that whole time. Then there's a story in the Talmud of Rabbi Shua ben Levi, I believe, that he had neighbors who were tormenting him and he wanted to curse them. And he knew that moment. And as soon as that moment arrived, he fell asleep. And this repeated itself a few times. He says, you know what? I think God doesn't want me to curse. He doesn't let me find that one moment. But sometimes God himself, we're asking God, you know in that moment, use it to destroy the wicked. Get rid of the evil in this world. But just to conclude, that Judaism generally believes that the way to deal with evil is by good. Bringing a little bit of light dispels a lot of darkness. But the danger in not recognizing evil for what it is that there are certain times that we cannot just rely on doing good. You have to roll up your sleeves and you have to fight the evil, especially the evil that threatens your very existence, materially and spiritually. So this is the one prayer that was sandwiched into the Shemona Esrei to give us the context, give us the balance. Yes, good is the majority of what our time is devoted to. We believe that the generation of light is what dispels darkness, but there are times when we can't just sit back and wait for the darkness to be dispelled. Good evening, and we hope you'll be back next week for the next blessing of the Shemona Esrei. Yeah.